Welcome to episode 185 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Jess Lifshitz about using inquiry to help kids develop critical consciousness so they can help make the world a better place. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, or find our new Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. This episode is brought to you in part by Student Treasures Publishing, which makes it super easy to publish a book with your class for free. You select the layout and fill the book with your students' writing and illustrations, and then receive a free deluxe hardcover copy of the book for your classroom, with options for parents to order their own copies too. And Truth for Teachers listeners get a $15 Amazon gift card when they publish their class book by May 15th, 2020. To turn your class's work into a professionally bound book, order your free class book publishing kit at studenttreasures.com/truth. I also want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, Power School. Teachers go above and beyond for students, but teachers need help too, especially as they're asked to do more every day. Power School, now with Schoology, is bringing together SIS, LMS, and assessment to give teachers simple solutions to everyday problems. They're committed to hearing and sharing teachers' stories of how technology can help solve problems in the classroom. So if you've ever wished for a quiz that could grade itself, or needed to quickly check which student has the crayfish allergy, tell us how technology can give you more time for what matters at powerschool.com/time for teachers. By sharing, you'll have a chance to be featured here or on their website. My guest today is Jess Lifshitz. She teaches 5th grade ELA in Northbrook, Illinois. It's a suburb of Chicago. Jess has been teaching for 16 years. In addition to her work in the classroom, she was part of the first cohort of Heinemann Fellows. She's written for several literacy publications, and she writes on her own blog regularly at crawlingoutoftheclassroom.wordpress.com. I've asked Jess to be on the show today because I love learning from her on Twitter, and I wanted to help amplify her work so more teachers can use inquiry, reading, and writing to help students better understand how to create positive change in the world beyond the classroom. Let's get straight to the good stuff. So, Jess, one of the things that impresses me most about your teaching is the way that you resist the option to just tell kids things. And instead, you set up opportunities for kids to uncover the answers for themselves. And you do it in a way that feels very natural and not forced. Can you tell us a little bit about your approach to teaching and the way that you use inquiry in your classroom?
Sure. I think a couple years into my teaching, I realized that if kids could come to an understanding about anything, they have greater ownership over that learning than if I were to stand up there and tell them those same things. And I think that's true of, if I'm trying to teach introduction strategies for opinion writing, right? If they can look at a piece of writing and come to their own understanding of how writers introduce their opinions, they are going to be more likely to use those strategies when they're doing their own writing. So if it's true of that, I think it's also true of sort of the bigger topics that we tackle in my classroom. If they can come to their own understandings about what bias is and how it forms, that is going to impact their lives so much more than if I stand up there and tell them what bias is and that we have bias or hold bias. So in everything that I do when I'm teaching, I try and design learning experiences that help the kids come to an understanding versus listen to me tell them thing after thing after thing, because I've just noticed that gives them more ownership, which makes it more likely that they'll use those lessons when I'm not around.
I feel like a lot of times as educators, we tell people things because it's easier than trying to come up with something inquiry-based.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that it takes a lot of time to structure these lessons and come up with ways for kids to uncover the answers?
I do. It takes a lot of time. I don't know that it takes more time, but the time spent preparing can sometimes just be on the front end more than once you're in the work. Because what I find is you spend a lot of time designing the learning experiences, but then once you're in there with the kids, they really take over a lot of the work. And then my job becomes simply to follow them and guide them. So I don't know that in the end I'm spending any more minutes, but I think I'm spending more minutes sort of on the front end. And the other piece that it really requires is that I do the work myself that I'm asking my students to do. A lot of the times, if we're doing, some of the more heavy lifting around things like confronting our own bias, I have got to make sure that I've done that work myself, that I've confronted my own bias, that I've really read the voices of other people outside of myself. And I have to make sure that I've done that work so I can anticipate where the kids are going to go, and then I'm better prepared to meet them there. So I think it's not any more work. It's just different work. I do a lot less copying, photocopying. I do a lot less, creating of worksheets. I do a lot less creating sort of artificial material, and I do a lot more of the learning and thinking and reflecting instead.
Let's give teachers a peek into what you're doing in your classroom. I follow you on Twitter, so that's how I'm able to see sort of glimpses into your classrooms, and you share photos of your anchor charts, and you also blog about it, and you have really detailed, explorations of your lessons and outlines of what you've done with kids. So I've seen your lessons about things like helping kids explore student identity, moving beyond a single story, seeing what isn't there, so critically studying history. I mean, these are really complex topics, and you're doing them with fairly young kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's really exciting to see, and I think these kinds of activities really set the foundation for deeper thinking, and they give kids a lens through which to view everything else that they learn throughout the year. So can you talk more about how this works in your classroom?
Sure. So when I take these big topics, and to be honest, a lot of the ideas of what I do in my classroom comes from looking at the adults around me and thinking about what I wish we as adults had been taught to do. And then I think, how can I sort of step back and bring those lessons to kids? So for example, when we're talking about, seeing what isn't there when reading about history, adults will say a lot of times, well, you don't know what you don't know. And that's true. I can accept that. But I think that when we say things like that, we almost remove the responsibility we have as adults to seek out what we don't know and notice when information maybe is being presented in a one-sided fashion or a overly simplified fashion. So if I wish adults were better at that, I sort of step back and think, okay, so how can I teach kids to do that? So with that kind of work, it really is teaching kids a process that they can go through anytime they're reading about history, and sort of teaching them some of the things to look out for. Are you being given the story of a person and only being shown that person in one aspect or in a sort of flat dimension? And then if you notice that that's happening, what can you do to seek out better resources? So once I can identify kind of what skills I want the kids to have, I always try and look for a concrete way to show kids what I'm talking about, because I can say, look, you all have been given an overly simplified version of history. I can tell them that, but that won't ever be as powerful as showing them a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And when they read that, they don't think that anything's missing because they've been shown the same set of information over and over again. So if I can give them that sort of simplified version of who this incredibly complex man was, and then ask them to sort of tell me what they know about him and show them, even just using one color of marker to write down the words that come up over and over again, they can see this picture that they have. And then I can bring in additional texts that show a greater depth and greater complexity. And I can just simply switch the color of marker that I'm using and add the new words that they're saying after reading additional text. And all of a sudden, they have this concrete example of all the things that were being left out. And so the next time they're reading about a figure from history or a current day figure, they can notice if they're only being given a narrow set of information. And then they have a process that they can use. They know how to seek out additional sources. They know how to make sure that they're hearing from multiple perspectives, that they're looking at texts beyond just those written for young children. They know where to seek out additional information. So I always am trying to look for a concrete example to start with, to sort of show them or highlight for them a problem that exists, and then provide them with a process that they can walk through on their own. And then a lot of what we do in the classroom is walking through that process together and tracking sort of our growing understanding, because I feel like that's really powerful for kids when they can see, this is what I thought at the beginning, and then after I walked through this process, this is now what I understand, because there's power in that. And if they don't experience it, it's hard to know just how much power that process holds.
One of my favorite lessons that you've shared is about helping kids identify and confront the biases they hold. And it started with a draw a scientist activity. Can you talk about how you did that?
We were kind of starting a lesson, a unit on looking at how we use clues to infer. And I asked them to draw scientists. I asked them to draw a group of athletes. I asked them to draw a nurse, and I asked them to draw a family. And they drew these pictures. And then I gave them a pretty simple Google form after they were done. And I just had them input the gender of the scientist they drew, the gender of the nurse that they drew, the genders shown in the athletes, and the makeup of the family. And because it was a Google form, we could quickly look at the results in this nice little pie chart. And I then displayed the data for them and just asked them what they noticed. And, it varies what our results are, but most often there is a majority of the scientists that are drawn as males. Where I really saw the bias show up is with the nurse. There were the vast majority of the pictures were female. With the athletes, I actually usually get mixed. And then with the family, it was almost all 4-member families, one mom, one dad, and then usually one brother, one sister. Sometimes kids would throw in a dog as well. And it was interesting because the families really did. I thought kids would each draw their own family, and they really didn't. They really sort of stuck to this very stereotypical, maybe storybook sort of stereotyped family.
See, that's interesting because I would have thought the same as you. They would draw their own, but when you're asking them to draw a family, they immediately know what they think the norm is.
Yep.
And so already they're getting messages about like, this isn't actually my family. I'm sure very few kids in your class are in that particular, dynamic, mother, father, brother, sister.
Mm-hmm.
And already they're aware of the fact that like, wait a second.
Yeah.
They're feeling othered.
Yes. And so once the data's up there, I really try and let the kids sort of come to their own conclusions about the data. And they very quickly start to sort of hit on issues of bias. And I remember last year, one of the most interesting comments was from one of my students. And he said about the nurse picture. He's like, what's so interesting is the doctor that I go to normally, the nurse that I always see is a boy. But when I drew a picture of a nurse, I didn't even really think about it. And I just drew a girl. And so, those are the moments where it's like you can see those light bulbs sort of going off, that it's like they're recognizing something's going on here that I'm not even aware of. And so the next step is to sort of, after we talk about what do you notice, is to give them space to just ask questions. And without fail, they end up asking sort of, why do we do this? Where do these images come from? Why do we have, and I introduced the word bias at that point. Why do we have these biases? And that leads us into looking at the texts that we read, and how do the texts that we read either reinforce or push us beyond the stereotypes that we hold. Because it's really important to me that kids can see that texts can do both. That yes, some of the things that we read and have read and have been read to reinforce these images, but texts also have the power to provide alternate images and push us beyond some of those stereotypes and move us forward through our biases. And it also sort of gives me a chance to show the kids that having bias doesn't make you a bad person, but refusing to confront that bias and try to do better, that becomes problematic. And so then that leads us into a conversation of, the texts that we choose to read, and how can we read critically, and how can we make choices in what we're reading that can move us beyond the biases that show up in the data.
How do lessons like this fit into your curriculum and the standards that you need the kids to meet and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So often when I talk with teachers, I get a question about, well, do you teach in a public school? Do you worry about standards? And of course, I do teach in a public school. And of course, I worry about standards. And what I have found, at least with the Common Core standards, the way they're written, they really, if we look at the standards themselves as the end point, I think it becomes really frustrating and limiting. But if we can look at the standards as more of a vehicle through which we can get to the bigger ideas we want to teach, then they become quite a bit more useful. And what I mean by that is when, we're taking a lesson like the bias lessons, and I move us into this idea of how can the text that we read affect our biases. I can fairly easily tie that to gathering text evidence and using evidence to support the claims we're making about our text. So if we then look at a fairy tale and I say, in this fairy tale, the male characters are shown only expressing emotions connected to anger and not sadness. And that reinforces this idea that it's okay for boys to feel angry but not sad. Then I have to back that up with text evidence. So what are the specific words that show me that? What are the specific characters and how are they acting? What examples from the text can I give? Those are all skills that are in the standards. So I think first we have to know the standards. And second, we think, how do we weave those standards into the bigger concepts and life skills and just good human citizen skills that we want our kids to learn. So it's almost using the standards to get to those bigger ideas. And that also, not only am I then covering the standards, but I'm also teaching them in a much more meaningful way, which I think gives my kids a better chance of really holding on to those skills.
Yes, absolutely. That's so good. There are really an endless source of thoughtful lesson reflections and anchor charts and all sorts of things on your website, which is crawlingoutoftheclassroom.wordpress.com. And also on your Twitter account, and your handle is Jess Fifth. So I really encourage everyone listening to this to follow you and utilize all of those resources you're sharing. But I also would love for you to share your lesson planning process a little bit. In other words, I don't just want teachers to use your lessons. I want them to understand your mindset. So they're thinking how you think and they can develop the lessons themselves so their students get exactly what they need.
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, I think so much of it begins with doing the work yourself. I think as I started to realize more how I needed to change my own thinking, I was better able to think about what I wanted to make sure I prepared my students to do. And so much of it, when I do this work, I think a lot of times teachers worry, well, won't people say that you're teaching your kids what to think? And I want to be really careful that what I'm teaching my kids is a process through which they can walk to reach their own understanding and their own opinions and their own beliefs, really based on reliable evidence and good sources. And so much of what I do starts with sort of this critical reading process. And I think about how can I teach kids to use this process across various contexts. And it always starts with, what can I give them so that they can begin with observation, just noticing what they see. And then from there, sort of interpreting those observations. So first we're going to observe, then we're going to interpret the observations, and then we're going to allow those interpretations to lead us to questions, and then teaching kids how to ask the kinds of questions that lead to further inquiry. Once we have questions, then I'm going to teach the kids how to look for additional resources. And then finally, after they spend time with those additional resources, giving them a chance to synthesize all that information and revise their thinking. So it's this process of observe, interpret, question, seek additional resources and information, and then synthesize and revise your thinking, that I really try and work into so many of the lessons that I'm bringing into my classroom. And I think once we become sort of comfortable with that process, it's easier for us then to plan the kinds of lessons that we can use in the classroom.
So you're repeating the same type of process over and over.
Right.
And the ideas for where you are deciding what to work on with your kids are based in the types of things you were seeing in the adults around you.
Right.
So the types of qualities that you were either exemplary or, sort of conflicts and problems that you were noticing in the world. You're like, man, I really want to prepare my kids for the world differently than that. I want them to be able to show up differently than that, or else work that you were doing yourself. And then that just sort of sprung out of it naturally, because that's something, of course, once I'm the same way. Once I learn something, or, there's some sort of self-coaching tool I have, or some new realization about my own thought process that I feel like makes me a better human, makes me more empathetic, helps me be able to communicate better with people or understand people better, or be more at peace within myself so that I can be at peace with others. I want to go share that. Like, that's the first thing that I want to do is help other people. So it sounds like that's what you're saying you're doing with your kids.
Absolutely. And I think I'm constantly looking at the models around me of the humans that I want my kids to grow up to be. And I'm constantly asking, what did they have to learn to be that kind of person? So, we see we see people stand up for strangers in, the supermarket when people are sort of going after them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to myself, what were they taught? What was that person taught that allowed them to become the kind of adult that's going to stand up for someone else? Someone taught them to appreciate cultures outside of their own. Someone taught them to use their voice in order to stop injustice. Someone taught them those skills, and I can't assume that anybody else is teaching my students that. I need to make sure that those are things I'm working into my classroom so that my students can grow up to be the kinds of people that I want to share this world with. So I think a lot of what I do comes sort of from that belief.
Mm-hmm. That taps into something that I feel like is such a major problem in schools that we're not really talking about a whole lot, which is the disconnect between how teachers are showing up in the classroom, who they are as people and their own personal well-being, and the ways that we're asking them to teach.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about schools that are asking teachers to do, inquiry-based work, project-based learning, really student-centered things, to be trauma-informed, to use restorative justice circles with kids. And meanwhile, in that school, the teachers are immediately written up for minor infractions,
Mm-hmm.
and they're never allowed to be human themselves. They're not allowed to have control and make their own decisions. They're not allowed to have days when they're feeling off, to be accommodated and supported and listened to, but they're expected to do that for students.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like if we want kids to be empathetic and understanding of people who are different and mindful of their own materialism, their environmental impact, their media consumption, just generally conscious citizens, we as educators have to show up as that ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
we have to be doing that work so that we can embody those traits, not just plan lessons on them or, teach regular lessons and then hope that a 2-minute conversation in the hallway was somehow consciousness raising for kids. We have
Mhm,
to fully live these principles
mhm,
or be moving toward intentionally fully living these principles. So the way that we interact with kids just sort of flows out of that naturally and isn't something that requires a scripted lesson.
right.
And I feel like that's something that you really embody well. It's clear that this is just coming from who you are as a person and the own work that you're doing on yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can share some of the practices and habits you have that support you in embodying what you're teaching and what you're bringing to your students.
Sure. I think part of it for me begins um, as a gay educator. I don't think I always have felt fully free to be who I am in the classroom. And knowing that experience, knowing what it feels like to feel like part of who you are isn't welcome in an educational space, that's a really tough thing to walk through the world with. And I think it has given me a lot of empathy for our students who are feeling that exact same thing. Um, I want, and I think because I know that experience, it's really important to me that I help kids see that if there's a part of you that you don't feel comfortable showing in the classroom, it is not because something is wrong with you. It's because something is terribly wrong with our world and our educational system. And knowing that reminds me that there are so many parts of our students that have been um, shut out of our classrooms. And it may be their sexual orientation, it may be their race, it may be the way that they feel comfortable sitting physically in a classroom. We are so narrow in our definitions of what a good student looks like. And I know what an impact it has on who you are as a person within a school space when you feel like something about you isn't welcome. And I think we reinforce those things without even realizing it in so many ways in our behavior systems, in our codes of conduct, in our dress codes, in the books that we read, in our curriculum. So, because I'm aware of that, I think I I want to work really hard to always broaden that image of what it means to be successful in a school space. And I always want to do what I can to make kids feel like all of who they are is welcome. And I think that guides so much of the way that I interact with kids. And I am certainly not perfect. Like, look, there are many moments where someone tapping their pencil, I want to feel okay with, but the noise is driving me crazy. Um, and so, there are moments where I have to have honest conversations with the kids too. But I think I really am just always aware of, am I making a child feel as if who they are isn't welcome here? And if I'm doing that, it is on me to fix it. It is not on the child to change who they are to fit my narrow image. It is on me to expand the image that I'm showing.
Do you have any advice for teachers who want to help their kids explore this kind of inquiry work or delve into some of these topics, but they're concerned that maybe their administration or the community that they teach in won't support them?
So what the best way I've found to sort of handle that goes back to knowing the standards. When I can wrap this work in the standards, it is much easier for me to explain to administrators and to families, to parents, why we're doing the work that we're doing. So, if I have a parent who's upset, we do sort of at the beginning of the year an inquiry that is sparked off a picture book about a family from Syria who fled their home and became refugees and were looking for safety. And that sort of led us then to reading more about Syrian refugees, and a parent just had some concerns that that was too political. So the conversation I had was that, look, our students are pretty darn good at reading, and connecting with texts that match their own lived experiences. What they struggle with more is reading experiences that are far beyond what they've ever lived and knowing how to deal with those texts and reach full comprehension. And so what the work that we're doing is helping them to get better at those skills. And that was hard for him to argue with. So I think part of it is wrapping the work that we do in the standards. And the other part is practicing having conversations with other educators about why we're doing this work. Because a lot of times when parents raise concerns, not always, but a lot of times they're curious as to why we're doing what we're doing. And if I've had practice, if I've had conversations about why we're doing this work, it is much easier for me to have those conversations with parents and administrators. And I always make the comparison. My first 2 years of teaching, I taught first grade. And it was sort of when invented spelling was just becoming a thing. And parents were really concerned about it. But as educators, we knew it was best for kids. And so we continued to do it, even though we knew parents would ask questions and have concerns and be upset about it. The difference was we had a lot of professional development about why we were doing this, why it was best for kids, what the research said. I find that we don't have that same level of professional development when we're talking about tackling tougher issues in the classroom. We aren't as practiced in those conversations. So we're more likely to be sort of ruled and guided by our fear. Because we don't know what we're going to say, it's easy to just not tackle these topics, to stay away from them. I think if we did more work in having the conversations and knowing our why, we as educators would feel more comfortable sort of jumping into the work.
So again, it's back to this idea of being rooted in these practices, about it just sort of overflowing out of the type of person that you want to be and the type of person that you want your students to be.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. What's something that you wish every teacher understood about teaching in ways that help kids make the world a better place?
I wish more teachers could see kids as co-conspirators and trust them with this work and follow them into the work, because children have this gorgeous sense of justice. And, they're not worried about things like taxes and money and, how we're going to pay for things. So they have the ability to really focus on what's just and what's right and what's good for other humans. And I find that so hopeful and so inspiring. And I think we can capitalize on that. But it really requires us to trust that kids can handle this work and then watch where they go and follow alongside of them, because there's so much power in that. And I think once you see it, it's hard to disagree with. So I wish more teachers would just trust that the kids are going to lead them someplace great.